Dobar dan svima, hvala vam na prisustvu. Prije svega, ja sam Hana Sokolović, bit ću moderator sa današnjeg webinara. Prije nego vas uvedim u webinar, zamolit ću vas da poslušate upute koje se tiču tehničkog načina funkcionisanja. Prije svega, obratite pozornost na poruku u chatu. Ukoliko vam je tokom trajanja panela potreban simultani prijevod ili sa BHS-a na engleski ili obratno, pritisnite tipku Translation, odnosno Interpretation u donjem desnom dijelu vašeg Zooma. Za pitanja tokom panela na raspolaganju imate chat kao i tipu Q&A. O tome ćemo svakako u vremenu predviđenom za diskusiju i pitanja. Hvala vam što ste danas s nama tu. Dobrodošli dakle na prvi webinar u okviru razgovora stručnjaka, globalni razgovori o regrutiranju, radikalizaciji i novim prijetnjama koji se realiziraju u sklopu projekta Istraživanje o negativnim efektima recipročne radikalizacije, finansijski podržanog od Ambasade Kraljevine Norveške u Bosni i Hercegovini. Ovo je dakle prvi od dva webinara u okviru razgovora stručnjaka. Današnji će trajati do 13:30 pod nazivom Rod, radikalizacija i regrutiranje. Panel će biti posvećen temama koje se tiču online radikalizacije. Razgovarat ćemo o tome na koji način mimovi i drugi sadržaji na Instagramu i Facebooku služe za kreiranje propagande i privlačenje pripadnika u radikalne skupine. Govorit ćemo o pripadnicama ženskih desničarskih grupa koje regrutiraju nove članove putem društvenih mreža, ali i o muškoj supremaciji, online mizoginiji i globalnoj desnici. Ove teme su, dakle, iako definitivno nedovoljno zastupljene u javnosti Bosne i Hercegovine, od velike važnosti, ne samo za mlade generacije za koje onako uvijek pomislimo da najviše koriste online prostor ili žene, koji će biti tema, nego za društvo u potpunosti. Kroz panel ćemo identificirati neke od mehanizama online radikalizacije, rodne razlike u načinima vrbovanja, ali i preporuke i strategije kako se globalno suočiti sa ovim problemima koje ćemo potom staviti u kontekst Bosne i Hercegovine. Govoriti o temi roda, radikalizacije i regrutiranja u generalnom kontekstu važan je korak u osvješćivanju stanja ovih pitanja u Bosni i Hercegovini, detekciji problema, ali i rješenja. Moje zadovoljstvo je da vam prije samog početka webinara predstavim naše paneliste, panelistkinje i diskusantice. Na samom početku naš prvi panelista bit će dr. Charlie Winter iz Centra za proučavanje radikalizacije. Tema razgovora je vizualna propaganda, vrbovanje putem interneta i mimovi kao oružje radikalizacije. Diskusantica je Neira Veljan, istraživačica Atlantske inicijative. Nakon toga, u drugom dijelu webinara, radujem se razgovoru sa doktoricom Eviane Leidig iz Centra za istraživanje o ekstremizmu, a tema našeg razgovora bit će žene, alternativne desnice i orodnjeno vrbovanje. U trećem dijelu webinara slijedi interesantan razgovor panelistkinje Grete Jasser, saradnice za istraživanje na Univerzitetu Hildesheim i doktorantice na Univerzitetu Leob Hanas sa diskusanticom Mejdom Čehajić-Čamparom iz Atlantske inicijative. Nakon ova tri razgovora slijedi diskusija, a potom i vrijeme predviđeno za vaša pitanja, komentare ili bilo kakvu vrstu feedbacka. Još jednom vam hvala na prisustvu. Pitanja koja budete imali tokom panela svakako možete pisati putem chata ili Q&A prostora predviđenog za to, a mi ćemo onda u vremenu koje je predviđeno za diskusiju na ta pitanja odgovarati i adresirati im govornicima, odnosno govornicama. Hvala vam dakle na pažnji, ostanite svakako s nama u naredna 2 sata, mislim da će biti izuzetno interesantno, važno i korisno za kontekst Bosne i Hercegovine, rodne ravnopravnosti, sigurnosti, društvene i svake druge, tako da garantujem da će ovaj razgovor biti daleko onako važniji nego što možda u nazivu koji je onako poprilično apstraktan može izgledati. Ja ću sada prepustiti riječ svojoj kolegici Neiri Veljan iz Atlantske inicijative.
So thank you, Hannah, for such a nice introduction. For all of you English-speaking attendees, you have interpretation below which you can translate. We have simultaneous translation also in English and in Bosnian. My name is Neira Veljan, as Hannah said, and I work at the Atlantic Initiative on topics related to radicalization and violent extremism. I have pleasure today to speak with Dr. Charlie Winter, who is a senior research fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization and research coordinator of the Global Network on the Extremism and Technology. His work focuses on how violent extremists use strategic communication to further their political and military agendas in both online and offline spaces. Winter is also a member of the Resolve Network Research Advisory Council, and his PhD at the Department of War Studies at King's College London was supported by Facebook as part of the online Civil Courage initiative. So let me start with my first question. Visual forms of political manipulation are an old age phenomena, but much has changed since printed posters and leaflets. Whereas before, political or extremist propaganda was challenging to manipulate and hard to circulate, now it's much easier for almost anyone to produce this kind of material and rapidly disseminate them. Understanding actually how these visual pieces of culture are used for communication and for manipulation provides insights into how social media has been able to amplify extremist groups' voice. According to many authors, studying symbols and references allow for understanding how, for example, far right can enter the mainstream. On the other hand, moreover, now when younger generations shift their attention to visual social media platforms, a better understanding of manipulative memes, visual propaganda, and their effects is necessary. So in your book, Apocalypse Later, a longitudinal study of Islamic State brand, you analyze Islamic State media strategy. Can you tell us how visual propaganda is employed on social media and how ISIS used it firstly as a recruitment strategy, then after to brand their failures as success?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I wish we could be doing this in person, and hopefully, maybe in a year we'll be able to. But anyway, it's great to be participating in this, and I'm excited to hear what my colleagues on the panel have to say in their sessions as well. The question you asked is I mean, I find it a really interesting one. I'm a massive nerd when it comes to visual propaganda, and can talk about it for ages. So it's great to have an opportunity to. I mean, when thinking about a group like ISIS, I think the first and most important thing to note is that while ISIS did a lot of things that were different and in some ways revolutionary when it came to using social media and producing propaganda, it is not unique at all in its approach to using media and deploying what it would call media jihad in order to expand itself as a movement, attract supporters, donors, and whatnot, to legitimize what it's doing on a day-to-day basis in terms of its expansion, military expansion, or its use of terrorism, or its governance practices as well, or indeed its use of media to intimidate and psychologically attack its adversaries. All of those things were exemplified very expertly by ISIS in the course of the last 5 years or so, or I mean, we're closer to 10 years now, actually. But none of those things are unique to it as an organization. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, because what conversations and research about ISIS communication can help us understand is not just how ISIS works as an organization, how supporters of ISIS radicalize and are recruited into it, but also how political extremism works from a structural perspective. So what sorts of ideas or grievances are shared across ideologies, across contexts, national contexts, political contexts, religious contexts, and so on and so forth. Having said that, to turn to ISIS as an organization and what it does and used to do. I mean, first of all, it put a huge amount of energy, a lot of money and human expertise into producing and publishing propaganda. It did so at a scale that was largely, well, possibly, I think, entirely unprecedented. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of unique pieces of propaganda being produced by its central media authority every single month. I mean, my PhD research focused specifically on one subset of that content, which was photographs. And in the 2-year period that I focused my research on, it published in excess of 20,000 images from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Egypt, and so on and so forth. And what is really interesting about those images, and I would say this because I did a PhD on it, but I genuinely think that it is interesting, is the fact that they're coming from a very diverse array of national contexts. These are different affiliates of ISIS the world over, who are all communicating about what they're doing from a military and governance perspective in a very, very similar way. There were guidelines issued by ISIS centrally about what they wanted to idealize about the caliphate as it used to be, how they wanted to lionize and make aspirational figures out of supporters of ISIS, how they wanted to communicate around martyrdom, around leadership, around theology and education in particular as well. So all of these things were very, very carefully thought of by ISIS, by probably just a handful of individuals sitting very high within the organization, who wanted to essentially determine what perceptions would be regarding the ISIS project, what perceptions would be regarding what it meant to join ISIS, what would happen if you were someone living in Europe and you migrated to Syria, you made hijra, as they call it. What would life be like at that point? What would your trips to the shops be like? Not just what would it be like running around on the battlefield with an AK-47, but what would your daily existence look like? What would your children's daily existence look like? So with that said, I think my preferred way to think about visual propaganda in this context is, yes, it was an instrument that was used by ISIS and ISIS recruiters and ISIS supporters to try to absorb others into the movement, but it was also used almost as evidence. They conceptualized it as something that could prove things that were meant to be the case about ISIS. So these 20,000 images, or the hundreds of hours of video footage that were published in the same period, it was all about selecting the best bits of what life in ISIS and under ISIS was like. Of course, it was very violent a lot of the time, but that was something that they embraced. It was exactly what they wanted to be communicating about. This is a kind of cosmic epic battle between ISIS, the Sunni Muslim in-group, versus the rest of the world, the non-Sunni Muslim out-group. So the positioning of its propaganda continually revolved around those two kind of groupings, those two demographics. And ISIS spent a lot of time trying to weave itself into this broader history of conflicts between Muslims and non-Muslims. And it was something that it did very effectively, I think. But at the same time, I think it's important to also keep in mind that it was very focused on a relatively small selection of target audiences. It knew the base that it was trying to communicate with, and it wasn't trying to create some sort of mass movement where millions of people the world over would join it. Of course, it would say that, but it was never trying to do that. It was very much trying to communicate with people that followed its kind of doctrinal rulebook, who believed Islam was what it believed Islam was. So I guess the short answer is it used it for lots of things, but it boiled down to an opposition between Muslims and non-Muslims, a historicization of the ISIS agenda, and three kind of core aims of propagation, legitimization, and intimidation.
Yeah, so that's really interesting for what you say, because also research findings in political mobilization and communication refers to frames as a tool that different extremists or political actors employ to shape the public interpretation in different issues. How did, for example, ISIS use the dissemination of these specific frames, themes, and narratives to target specific group audiences?
So I suppose a good way to get into that would be to think about, I mentioned earlier that there were a few very kind of systematic ways that it would idealize its soldiers or demonize its enemies. And what we know, I should say that the ISIS media apparatus, the central institution in charge of producing all of this stuff, is very, very secretive. It is kind of by definition public facing, but in terms of who calls the shots, who's in charge, who determines the thematic parameters of the ISIS brand, all of those things are very, very much secret. However, back in 2015, 2016, there were a series of US Special Forces raids on ISIS media officials in Afghanistan. And in the course of those raids, they managed to capture some documents that were internal documents produced by the central media apparatus and then disseminated across South Asia, Iraq, Syria, North Africa, West Africa, and so on and so forth. Now, in the course of these documents, there are a few that advise on how to take photographs, how to kind of think about framing of imagery and how to make a good video, what sorts of editing and post-production techniques need to go into it. But what was undoubtedly my most interesting find in the course of those documents was what was said specifically about framing, about storyboarding, about thinking about narratives in a way where you essentially go out on your photographic venture, or if you're a media operative, if you're tasked with taking videos of ISIS battles on the front lines. The advice from ISIS centrally was to know what your end goal was, know what the resultant narrative was that you were working towards before you even pick up your camera. So they really did think about this very deliberately, very systematically, and there wasn't much, if any, opportunism when it came to determining what the key ideas were that would characterize what ISIS was doing. So just thinking about the soldiers, so what it would call the mujahideen, there were 5 or 6 key themes or frames that would characterize what the ideal mujahid in ISIS was like, and what they did on the battlefield and off the battlefield. So there would be images that would conform to Western influenced conceptions of what the ideal warrior would look like. So they would be shown to be courageous, putting themselves in harm's way, even if it meant risking death on the battlefield. So there'd be a lot of images of ISIS fighters kind of standing on top of hills, kind of shooting a gun right into the enemy. Even though, of course, that could be completely staged, but in order to kind of get this sense that they had no care for their actual safety and security. Another frame that was dominant was this idea of brotherhood, of camaraderie. So there'd be lots of images off the front line, so away from battle, where you would see ISIS fighters in groups, eating together, drinking tea together, watching propaganda together. There's a lot of images and videos of ISIS fighters watching propaganda. And it was all about kind of constructing this idea that if you join ISIS, you're joining a movement, you're joining a brotherhood, you're joining a community. And that was very, very important for the kind of appeal that ISIS held and continues to hold in some senses for foreign fighters, for the tens of thousands of foreign fighters that joined it between 2013 and 2016 in particular. There would also be images, a lot of images, showing ISIS fighters reading the Quran or praying. Now, this is a very, very important aspect of what ISIS wants its supporters to think it's about. Of course, it's a political movement, it has material goals, it has military goals, but everything that it does, it tries to frame that through the lens of the religion of Islam. So it spent a lot of time, and it did this with civilian supporters as well, it spent a lot of time trying to demonstrate that people fighting for it, people living under it in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere, were entirely committed to the religion of Islam, first and foremost. Beyond anything else, they were doing this because of their kind of devotion. And it was that kind of framing, that kind of systematic repetition, continuous repetition. I mean, I mentioned those 20,000 images between 2015 and 2017. Now, there would be a lot of variation in the course of those 20,000 images, similarly with the videos as well. But in terms of the way that particular narratives and ideas would surface on a very continuous and consistent basis, it was clear that they really wanted to drive home these particular ideas. They wanted people observing on the internet to internalize what these kind of ideal notions of fighting, of living, of worship, of governance were. And in that sense, through propaganda, through visual propaganda in particular, videos and photographs, but also through the kind of audio statements and radio programming it did too, ISIS generated an alternate version of reality through what it was publishing online. This alternate version of reality was grounded in what was happening in Syria and Iraq predominantly, but it was composed only of the things that ISIS wanted to talk about, only of the things that ISIS wanted to show off about. So it was a very consistent and comprehensive idealization of what it was to be part of this movement, and why this movement should be supported, at least in its view.
So they were also one of the actually first global movements that actually involved so many women in their lines. And because of that, some analysts think that they were so successful because they attracted women. Also, how actually visual propaganda looked like when it came to women. And then we can...
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question. I suspected it might come up, but I'm really glad that it did, because one of the most fascinating things about this alternate reality that ISIS produced or kind of created through propaganda is that there are no women ever present in any photographs, in any videos. Occasionally, very, very occasionally, you'll see images of young girls in school, for example. There's one video that sticks out that was published in July 2016 from Euphrates province, it used to span Iraq and Syria, eastern Syria and western Iraq. And in that video, there was an interview with a little girl who was talking about why ISIS was a great place to live and why she felt secure there. But in terms of the depiction of adult women, they would never, ever, ever deliberately feature in video or photo content. So again, clearly a systematic and deliberate decision had been made to not depict women at all. Which is interesting because we know that so many women went to join ISIS. And I think that kind of points to one of the things that we really need to keep our minds on when thinking about how this group appealed to so many people in the way it did. Propaganda was part of a package of measures that it deployed, a package of activities that were all geared towards expanding appeal for the group. And generating a sense of what it was about. But when it came to the actual recruitment of people, and whether they were from Saudi Arabia or Tunisia or Germany or the UK, it was often very, very reliant on pre-existing networks, social networks, families. People would have these pre-existing relationships that would be fundamental in helping them decide whether to make hijrah to Syria or Iraq. I mean, even back in 2014, it wasn't easy to join ISIS. It was easier than it is now, but you'd still, like if you're going from the UK, for example, you'd have to fly to somewhere in Turkey. You'd have to know how to get to southern Turkey without being picked up or kind of targeted by security services in the country, whether that's Turkish security services or others. Then you'd have to know exactly how to get across the border into a war zone, lest we forget. And then you would have to know how to be received by ISIS and not some other group of jihadist rebels. So there were a lot of different things that had to take place in order for someone to successfully make hijrah. It wasn't just like flicking a switch. And the way that those logistical aspects of joining ISIS were facilitated is through people, through pre-existing relationships, through conversations that were happening on social media, not through propaganda. There were never any specific kind of instructions given by ISIS to on how to actually make it to join ISIS. Propaganda kind of gave the evidence base, it gave people the impetus, but then there was a whole logistical operation that needed to facilitate everything else. And that logistical operation was facilitated through real people who knew the people that they were trying to recruit, who had been engaging with them for weeks, months, sometimes years before. So that's a really important aspect of the ISIS recruitment approach. That again, it's not just ISIS that does things like this. This is a way of engaging in political outreach, which is relied on by violent extremists across the spectrum. There is the kind of online public outreach, but also social networks, pre-existing relationships, they really, really matter. Just to quickly go back to your question about the depiction of women, I mentioned that there were kind of vanishingly few instances in which female supporters of ISIS would ever appear in its propaganda. That did begin to change in, where are we? So in 2021 now, 2018 was the first time that ISIS went public about deploying women on the battlefield. This was something which is very, very controversial within the jihadi ideology. Whether or not women are able to engage in combat. And ISIS essentially broke with the conventional position on engaging in combat. And in 2018, early 2018, it was actually sending women to the front lines with assault rifles and so on, and using them in offensive operations, offensive campaigns. And that was something that was communicated about fairly irregularly, but through video propaganda exclusively, that did demonstrate that women were playing an active role in combat operations. And that was something which was a really important moment, not just for ISIS, but for jihadi violent extremist groups across the spectrum as well, because it was something that was very different, very new, and also had been something that was flagged and hinted at by ISIS for a very long time. In terms of what that meant for the amount of support that it received from either gender, from men or women, it didn't. I think it came at a point in the history of ISIS, or the recent history of ISIS, that was too late for it to kind of transform the appeal that it had, simply because by 2018, it had lost Mosul, it had lost Raqqa, it had lost almost all of its territory in Iraq and almost all of its territory in Syria. So it wasn't the kind of proto-state offering that it had been. But perhaps if there is a resurgence one day, and I'm not sure that there will be anything that looks similar to what happened in Syria and Iraq in 2013, 14 and 15. But if there is a resurgence one day, then maybe, now that it has kind of gone public with that aspect of it, it may go public even further and try to kind of institute it even more into the fabric of it as an organization.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, because, you know, it's an eternal question who actually fought on the battlefield. So also, you mentioned that some research suggests that, you know, also some research suggests that people can self-radicalize in online spaces and involve in violent extremist groups by visiting and spending time in other, for example, male-dominated online communities that produce deepfake videos, memes, video games, and so on. But on the other hand, as you suggest, that there should be human influence behind it, and there are always some networks. But also, despite this suggestion that images are suitable for spreading manipulated forms of information, there's shortage of studies examining how information is communicated in these online visuals and what their impact is. So what do you think, actually, what are the main similarities and differences between the far right and Islamist propaganda outreach?
Yeah, so I will caveat this answer by really emphasizing that I'm not an expert in the far right when it comes to outreach, and I will defer to my colleagues on the panel entirely on this. But I do have a broad sense from the work I do with GNet, as well as with colleagues at ICSR, of some of the kind of key kind of structural approaches that individuals and organizations on the extreme right wing and other ideologically motivated violent extremist groups, the sorts of methods that they adopt. And I would also add that the kind of meme culture, so the sharing of sometimes meant to be humorous images or posters and that sort of thing, does have a richer pedigree and history for the far right than it does among jihadi groups. That being said, ISIS in particular, its supporters, that it calls them munasirin, which literally means supporters. Its online supporters do spend a lot of time making memes these days. Some of them that borrow from there's a kind of few recurring characters that you'll see in right-wing memes. I don't know any of the names of them, but there's one of like a badly drawn man who you're nodding, so I think you know the one I mean. But I've seen that come up a few times on one of ISIS's discussion boards on Rocket Chat. And I think it's interesting to see that kind of cross-fertilization and mimicry happening between kind of, by definition, entirely opposed ideologies and ideological positions. I also saw some ISIS supporters just this morning talking about Odyssey, some videos that they'd been watching on Odyssey. And that kind of was particularly interesting because I'd never kind of seen any discussion about Odyssey from jihadis before. And it was happening on a part of the jihadi ecosystem, which is very, very much closed off. It was on a password protected server that ISIS administers itself. So yeah, that was just a quick side note on that aspect of things. In terms of the way that jihadi extremists and extremists in general engage in outreach online and how that outreach factors into an individual radicalizing and then ultimately becoming enlisted with a particular movement. There's a really interesting case study that emerged back in 2015 that I find myself thinking about quite a lot. It was an individual, an 18-year-old boy. He certainly looked younger than 18 when he went, but an 18-year-old called Jake Beladi, who was a convert to Islam from Melbourne, Australia. And he traveled to join ISIS at the end of 2014, I think it was. And then there was a lot of discussion, a lot of media attention on him because he did look so young and he had this long hair that kind of went over his face. And there are a few images that emerged of him online where people thought that he was, it was a fake, and that the kind of people, there was an article in the Daily Mail, which is a terrible newspaper we have in the UK, that dubbed him the emo jihadi because he looked so out of place. But anyway, Jake Beladi ended up killing himself in a suicide operation in May of 2015. And what's really interesting is he was keeping a blog at the time, a Tumblr blog, I think it was, called The Diary of a Muhajir, so the diary of a migrant to ISIS, essentially. And in his last entry, which was called From Melbourne to Ramadi, Ramadi was the Iraqi city in which he blew himself up, he gave an account of his radicalization. And he went into a lot of detail about the kind of psychological and intellectual journey, and not very much detail about the logistical side of it. But what's really interesting when reading it is that, and it's a very long bit of work, and it's very, very well written. He was clearly an intelligent guy. What's really interesting is he talks about going from having a kind of passing interest in the Syrian war to then engaging with a community of observers of the Syrian war that were leaning towards kind of a more Islamist perspective on things. And then he speaks about how the more he spoke with them, the more he engaged with them, he began to see that this was a story of the Syrian war was a story of Islam against the enemies of Islam, that it was the persecution of Sunni Muslims in the east and north of the country in particular, and that this was not just something that was happening now, but something that had been happening throughout history and so on and so forth. He then speaks about how propaganda began to enter into his daily kind of consumption habits online, and how that tipped the balance for him away from just understanding Syria through the lens of a panoply of different Islamist organizations, to understanding what was happening in Syria through the specific framing that ISIS was giving at the time. And then there's a long period where he is following Syria very closely, but he's not going to Syria, he's not going to Iraq. He's just kind of consuming news about it, consuming a very agendaed news about it. And then he speaks about how he met some people online. He decided that he wanted to go, and he met some people online who only after a series of specific attempts were able to direct him to where to fly to in Turkey and which border crossing to go to, and then what to do once he arrived in Syria. But I find that bit where his specific words, I remember it vividly, that he met some brothers online. So these brothers would have been individuals who were in ISIS, who were able to direct him, give him the specific logistical advice that he required. And I always think about that meeting, something that clearly would have happened because he decided it would happen. He went out looking for these people, but also they were there ready to talk to him. They were there ready to receive him. And they were there ready to kind of build on the very, very strong foundation of radicalization that he had kind of developed himself through his own consumption habits, his own conversations on social media. And I think that is a story that repeats time and time again, that it's the kind of evolution of one's position towards something that's more and more radical. It doesn't happen because of any one thing. It doesn't happen because you watch one video of someone being beheaded, or you read one article about how there's a conspiracy against Islam, or for that matter, a conspiracy against white people, for example. It's something which has to happen incrementally with social interaction, whether that's online or offline, but social interaction with real people who are, whether they're in the same country or not, who are giving specific advice, who are responding to your thoughts, responding to your ideas. And yeah, maybe they are deliberately leading you down a particular path. Maybe they aren't. Maybe it's something that's happening more organically. But even when someone like Jake Biladi, who does seem to be one of those rare individuals who radicalize primarily through or on the back of online activities and interactions, there still needs to be other people around him, whether they're in the real world or on kind of in the virtual world. And I kind of think that having a neat separation between real and virtual is becoming increasingly problematic, really. The virtual and the real are happening in the same place. People's lives are as much online as they are offline. And I think that Jake Biladi's story, while it was very unique to him as a Melbourne teenager who ended up dying in a suicide operation in Iraq, I think it does elements of it repeat, not just in the context of ISIS, not just in the context of jihadist extremism, but in the context of extremism across the political and ideological spectrum.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. It's really like we as an organization also, we deal with the same process of the radicalization, for example, and we see that also a security issue of, the process of radicalization into non-violent extremists are, are a fertile soil to engage in much more violent, extremist groups. And at the end, I have one more question, and then we can wrap up. You have, I think, 2 or 3 minutes more. Okay. So, like, regarding all of this that we kind of talked about, how can we actually create counter narratives and propose effective strategies when it comes to visual propaganda spread by extremist groups?
I'm glad I only have 2 minutes, because it's a possible question, but definitely impossible in 2 minutes. I mean, the question of counter narratives and alternative narratives and responding to extremist propaganda in a way that challenges the basis of what these groups are trying to communicate and trying to generate appeal based on is a really, really difficult thing. Something that I mean, I would imagine definitely millions, definitely tens of millions, possibly hundreds of millions of dollars or pounds or euros or whatever has been spent on in the last few years. And it's something which doesn't seem to be going away, because the problem of extremism isn't going away. There's certainly been a learning process. In the context of jihadism, which I'm a lot more au fait with, a lot more kind of aware of, there have been some really terrible initiatives that have been fundamentally flawed from the outset. And whether those have been delivered by governments or by think tanks or activist groups, what is really important to keep in mind is that even if they haven't had the desired effect, even if there's been news stories about them being ineffective or humiliating or whatever, it's still really important they happen. It's still really important that people are trying to respond to what extremists are doing, because the only way that we're going to be able to develop counter-narrative or alternative narrative programming or activities that are effective is by trying and learning from our mistakes. I mean, the particular instance I'm thinking about here is a video that was published by the US State Department in 2014 that was incredibly violent, that essentially pulled together a collection of execution videos that had been made and published by ISIS with the specific intent of making ISIS look like it was killing its enemies and doing so in horrible ways and humiliating them and all that stuff. And this particular video, it brought those videos together and kind of did it again, and then it was shared by the US government's account on Twitter and on YouTube, and then it was ridiculed in lots and lots of different circles. There was a big Washington Post article about it, but anyway, notwithstanding the fact that there was lots that was problematic about that video, it was still a really important thing to happen in the kind of recent history of counter-narrative or counter-extremism communications, because it demonstrated very clearly what does and doesn't work, and also demonstrated that we need to think a bit more counterintuitively about how to respond to groups like ISIS. And we have to realize that if, for example, you're a government actor, and there's a range of things that you think are deplorable about an extremist group, supporters of that extremist group won't think that those same things are deplorable. And it may in fact, or they may in fact very much cherish and like those things. So there needs to be a really proactive effort to think not subjectively and not through the same kind of range of cultural biases and so on, if you're trying to communicate with a particular target audience. And there needs to be a lot of research that goes into understanding the sentiments of the target audiences that are also being targeted by extremist groups. It's not enough to just think, I think that they won't particularly like this aspect of the group, so I'm going to try and communicate about that aspect of the group. That's when things backfire, and that's when things become very problematic. But I would add that we're in a much better position now than we were 10 years ago, 5 years ago, because of mistakes like that being made. So while it is frustrating when you see things that don't land well, or that are counterintuitive or ineffective, it's also just really important that they're happening, that people are trying, and that there is a continuous push to try to keep momentum behind counter-narrative and counter-extremism communications.
Yeah, so thank you, Charlie, really much on this pleasure conversation. So back to you, Hannah, so we can continue.
Thank you, Neda, and thank you, Charlie. It was a highly interesting and insightful conversation between you two. As I've announced in the beginning, I will be discussing the next topic with our panelist, Dr. Eviane Leidig. A bit more about her before we begin. She is a postdoctoral affiliate at the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo. Her research currently explores the far-right, gender and online radicalization, recruitment, and propaganda in India and North America. She is a co-founder and co-editor of a new Manchester University Press book series called Global Studies of the Far Right. In addition to her academic pursuits, she serves as the head of policy for the London-based Center for Analysis of the Radical Right and is an associate fellow of the Global Network on Extremism and Technology. Eviane regularly consults and gives talks for policymakers such as the US State Department, the European Commission, national and regional intelligence agencies, and law enforcement, and the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. Her work has appeared in several international media outlets such as BBC, Al Jazeera, Foreign Policy, Huffington Post, and Radio Free Europe. Given this outstanding biography, it will be my pleasure to speak to Eviane. Thank you for being with us today. Now, as I know, you are currently working on a book, Women of the Alternative Right. Info from your website says that this book is the first in-depth look into the world of female alt-right influencers online. It unfolds through the experiences of the author, or you, in discovering a community represented through the digital lives of women in the alternative right who have gained social media popularity. And now, online recruitment, as we have heard previously with Charlie speaking, is a broad field for discussion. Research shows, however, that there are gender differences which should be a topic of our attention. What is important to know about gender dynamics of online recruitment?
Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. It's quite a pleasure. And also thank you for discussing my book as well. So what I'll be discussing today is based on research I have done for a book on women in the alts, right? And their leadership roles as influencers for the movement. So I'm not going to be discussing, for instance, female voters for far-right political parties, for example. So I just want to set in those limitations at the beginning. And also I just want to, point out, I think what's a very basic but important fact, which is that the far-right landscape is incredibly diverse and varied, and there are many different types of organizations and groups and political parties that attract many different types of individuals. But for today's focus, of course, we'll focus on the growth of online networks and communities. And I also want to make clear that often recruitment and radicalization are interconnected processes. And sometimes a person is recruited and then radicalized, and sometimes they're radicalized and then recruited, and sometimes they just both happen at the same time. So it's incremental, like Charlie mentioned earlier, but it's important to bear this in mind. And so I often discuss recruitment and radicalization simultaneously. Now, when it comes to looking at gender differences, this is such an important point that's often overlooked, but it's useful to understand how far-right narratives sort of appeal to potential recruits, to men and to women, quite differently. And I know we'll get more into the type of topics and so forth that are discussed. But in addition to this, when it comes to online recruitment, it's often incredibly personal stories as well of individual grievances. So in my research, I found for the book that, there's a whole genre of YouTube videos of people discussing sort of their personal journeys of being red-pilled. So for those who aren't familiar with the term, red pill comes from the 1999 film The Matrix, in which the protagonist Neo is offered to take the red pill, in which he'll be sort of awakened to the truths in society, or he could take the blue pill and sort of remain a life of ignorance. And I'm sure Greta will talk about this as well. And for the far right, taking the red pill means being awakened to a sort of leftist, sort of pro-immigrant society that's sort of controlled and dominated by feminists in particular. And again, I'll let Greta sort of get into that. But within this whole genre of YouTube videos, it's many personal journeys of being red-pilled and reflecting on, sometimes 1 or 2 hours of their experiences of being red-pilled. So certainly finding agency and finding happiness is something that is quite a crucial aspect of understanding sort of online recruitment processes. So for women in particular, many of them are well-educated, have professional jobs and live in urban centers. And they describe a period of, depression and being deeply unhappy with their life situation. And that being red-pilled meant that they could find traditionalism and happiness through that. But sort of these narratives can be, in terms of like finding their authentic selves through these red pill journeys, it often masks the very hateful and harmful ideology of the far right as well. Because it's seen as sort of a journey of finding self-confidence, of losing friends and family and social support networks. But again, that then masks, what's really quite a hateful ideology within these far-right movements.
Thank you for this answer, Eviane. Now, if we take into account what you've just said and combine it with what happens daily, a huge amount of content on social networks, a big number of social media platforms available as well, new questions come to my mind. Given the dynamics of how social media platforms develop, popularity of certain social networks among different generations, combined with the massive content produced daily, which I mentioned in the beginning, a question which rises is, how is radicalization and propaganda channeled through social media platforms, and which ones are commonly used for these purposes?
Yeah, it's actually such a big question, so I'll try to condense that. Well, firstly, different platforms serve different purposes. So you have on the one hand more mainstream platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Reddit to some extent, which often provide exposure and sort of amplify these narratives to a quite wide audience. And I think this is a very key point to bear in mind. On the other hand, you have perhaps more niche or fringe platforms such as the Chan spheres, so 4chan, 8chan, so many chans, or encrypted apps like Telegram, which in these senses already serve as sort of self-radicalization hubs because they are quite reinforcing instruments. And these type of more niche platforms have a very strong culture and community built within them in terms of the type of language that's used, the humor, the meme production, etc. And then also you have the another type of platforms, which are really the alt tech platforms. So these are platforms created by those within the far right, served for other far right users. And these can be quite insular platforms. Platforms like Gab, which I know Greta will probably talk about, Patreon, which is like a payment processor that's quite similar to Patreon, Parler, and these spaces are already quite, these act as echo chambers in the sense that these are already quite radicalized spaces. An important aspect to understanding far-right radicalization and propaganda on these social media platforms is also that, you know, far-right users are extremely adaptable to online spaces, and they know how to circumvent and use these platforms quite effectively to get across their message. So as an example, as I mentioned with the YouTube red pill videos, you know, there might be some type of cross-platform posting sort of to complement these YouTube videos. So for example, one female alt-right influencer that I researched in the book, she has a couple videos about her red pill journey, but then she'll also post photos on her Instagram account, and she'll use terms such as glow up, which is a term within the beauty blogging community, and that signifies somebody who sort of engages in like a detox, you know, both like internally and externally, and it takes months, it takes years to sort of achieve their best self. And this is actually the first time I had actually come across someone using Instagram specifically for this purpose of recruitment and radicalization. But, you know, sort of mixed within this glow up narrative was also this, she used this term deprogramming as well, that deprogramming takes years. And so it's a quite insidious way of using these platforms. But again, this sort of points to how effective some of these far-right individuals can be online. And as I sort of mentioned, you know, in terms of, you know, cross-platform posting is also very common in order to sort of attract audience and insight into their everyday lives. So for example, some of these influencers might solicit questions on Twitter that they will then answer on their YouTube channels, for example, during live streams, or some might use other type of social media platforms such as Odyssey, which Charlie had mentioned. For many of these influencers, sites like Odyssey, which is it's a similar site to YouTube. They use Odyssey sort of as a backup or secondary channel to upload their videos. And sort of finally, when it comes to understanding, you know, radicalization and propaganda, you know, there's also a plethora at the moment, so sort of live streaming videos and favoring sort of real-time donors during these live streams who will sort of donate money during the live stream, and then those donations get bumped up to the top of the chat function. So that actually provides sort of an incentive for their followers in terms of being able to interact and sort of get a glimpse into having that really personal connection.
Thank you. It's basically impossible to keep track of all of the apps which are currently being used, all of the social media platforms. Now back to the topic of your book again, Women of the Alternative Right as a part of the phenomena you researched. You described them in the short intro available at your website as influencers who use mainstream platforms to build audiences through recruiting and radicalizing followers. You have pointed out previously that often recruitment and radicalization are interconnected. And now, how do these women become alternative right influencers at all? What kind of content do they produce? You've mentioned a couple of examples now, but what is the content in general, and how do they gain their audience?
Right, so for some of these women, they are connected to established organizations. So some in the US, for instance, are connected to, well, the now defunct American Identity Movement, which is previously known as Identity Europa, which played a very significant role in the deadly Charlottesville rally in 2017. Others are connected to, say, the Identitarian Movement in Europe, a youth-led grassroots anti-immigrant movement. And then on the other hand, there's some of these female alt-right influencers who really gain what's known to be a micro-celebrity status on YouTube. So in media and communication studies, there's this term micro-celebrity, which is somebody who is a sort of celebrity within a very niche audience. And that's precisely what these women are within the alt-right, within the far-right. They sort of have a brand recognition. They're quite easily identifiable for the type of videos and content that they produce. So it's definitely a mix in terms of some already have pre-existing connections to organizations and some don't. And also, you know, some of these female alt-right influencers have relationships with men in the movement. So often, you know, they'll be married or dating other men within far-right movements as well. But what I found in my book to be quite interesting was that many had described their start of their red pill journeys by watching male YouTubers and sort of being inspired by the conversations taking place there, and then feeling encouraged to create their own channels to contribute to that conversation. And sort of as I mentioned above, you know, content by these women is quite tailored to different platforms, and I'm sure we'll get more into the type of topics that they discuss. But in terms of the background of these women, you know, this is how they become quite prominent leaders within the alt-right.
Thank you. Given this info about their path and engagement methods for the audience, I'm wondering, social media platforms are used broadly today by all generations, people with different backgrounds, whether we're speaking of educational, financial, social backgrounds. So what did your research show? Who makes the audience of these alternative right female influencers? Because obviously there are these micro stars, and if they do manage to engage a lot of people in their content, who are these people and how and why do they engage? Is it only women or both men and women?
Yeah, that's such an important question, Anna. So, I mean, first of all, I should say that, you know, my research focuses on millennial and Gen Z audiences, right? So I don't necessarily look at older generations. But I found that it's both men and women who make up their audience. And I had actually expected more female supporters of these women when I started off writing the book. I had assumed, well, why else would you have a woman in the alt-right who's creating content, right? But I actually found that most of these women have more male followers than female followers. In fact, one of them had mentioned that she looked at her YouTube analytics and found that 85% of her viewers are male, which really surprised me when I was writing the book. But then again, as it comes to looking at different platforms that have different functions, we see that perhaps they might have more male viewers on YouTube, but on Instagram, they might have more female followers. So it can be quite different. For men, you know, they tend to tailor the content in the sense that these female alt-right influencers often say to men, join us, join the movement, and you'll find an obedient life. So you can have the type of life that you want to envision. And that's, you know, their movement is quite pro-men as opposed to sort of society supposedly being anti-men and using that type of narrative. For women, it's often about finding a type of sisterhood if they join the alt-right, and the joy and sort of traditionalism in being a mother and a wife. And, you know, I often see this, for example, through Instagram accounts of cooking recipes, making butter, lacto-fermentation, you know, all types of, I learned actually a lot about different cooking techniques while writing the book, them playing with their children and homeschooling children, etc. And then in terms of how the content reflects the individual influencers, you know, I also see that their content changes based on how these women's lives evolve as well. So when I started writing off the book, you know, one of the influencers was still single, then she became engaged, got married, and then her propaganda had changed during that time as well. She created another YouTube channel which doesn't discuss politics, but discusses motherhood and invites guests on there to discuss these topics. And then as I'm listening to those channels supposedly devoted to motherhood, they'll start then talking about reproducing the white race. So, you know, there's obviously a lot of intermingling in terms of the personal and the political.
So I just need to jump in with a quick question. Could this mean that a lot of people are often consuming these kind of contents without realizing that they are created for these purposes? Like people like myself, for example.
Yeah, would a random person be able to? I think it's actually quite unlikely considering how the algorithm recommendation works. You kind of already have to be inserted into this space in terms of already viewing you know, quite related contents in order to come across this. So yeah, I don't think that someone who's interested in say a cooking channel would come across these influencers.
Okay, that's comforting. Now, hearing about who makes the audience of female alt-right influencers, kind of, you know, I found examples while doing research for this panel of incredibly popular female alt-right influencers. We even have real-life speaking tours in different, in different states where they meet their fans who actually pay a lot of money to listen to these influencers live. Even though certain social networks react when the content becomes transparently discriminative and hateful, it is not always the case. You have just spoke about a lot of these subtle ways these influencers work. Now, in which way do they present the topics they discuss, and how much do they rely? You also mentioned it a couple of times, but could you give us a more in-depth info? How much do they rely on promoting traditional gender norms in attracting their audience?
Yeah, so this is really the core of their message. So I mean, first and foremost, you know, one of the key topics is discussing anti-feminism and anti-LGBTQ rights, and sort of exploring these two movements as sort of the main cause for what the alt-right, what the far-right sees to be societal decay, as sort of the breakdown of traditional gender norms. So as you can imagine with the far-right, it's about promoting what they see to be natural and biological masculinity and femininity, and that men and women should take on these traits, and that if they do, society will be happier, or problems will be solved, and there won't be any disagreements between the sexes. In addition to this, there's also very strong anti-immigrant, anti-Islam, anti-Jewish, much xenophobic and nationalist content as well. That's still quite important to understand in terms of, you know, some of these women sort of make a career out of espousing the need to protect Western civilization, which they use the dog whistle to talk about white nationalism and white supremacy. And so, yeah, absolutely, the role of traditional gender norms is so significant in terms of, yeah, also how they, you know, appeal to potential recruits and radicalize. But it's also, when I was writing the book, just these very banal everyday things as well, like their lifestyles. So, you know, sort of just tracking their sort of Instagram stories, which, you know, disappear in 24 hours, but the snaps that they take about making dinner, and sort of creating different types of accounts. So one might be a more political Instagram account about speaking tours, about being at anti-immigrant rallies, versus another Instagram account by the same influencer could just be home life and domestic life. So certainly, as I mentioned before, in terms of that micro celebrity dimension, it's a very interactive sort of being able to discuss politics on the one hand versus being able to discuss, I don't know, nutrition during pregnancy, sort of at the same time, which I find quite fascinating, but it's quite interconnected.
Yeah, so basically, next to offering the ideas of the alt-right, they offer the desirable everyday life to their audience, right? Like we know that when it comes to, you know, the general perception, the social perception on the social media platforms, you always have to represent the best of yourself or any kind of content given. So if they use these kind of everyday photos, cooking, just displaying the you know, the amount of how their life is good at functioning, how everything is in its place, it might be one of the factors that kind of attracts especially the generations you are researching on.
Yes, absolutely. And it adds such a personal dimension where their life is on display to anybody on an app at any time, right? It's not like it's a secluded network or group where you have to sort of, secretly attend some meetings and meet some people. I mean, it's really quite visible and prominent, which is why I mentioned the mainstream platforms before, because they provide such visibility and amplification for these individuals.
Now, to wrap up all that you've said and to answer my final question, Charlie was really happy with this question. I believe you will be as well. What are your ideas and approaches on how to counter the far right, both online and offline?
Yeah, once again, a very big question for a limited amount of time. I think we could have a whole panel just about this question. So sort of in the book, I do outline in the final chapter what are some approaches to sort of counter and challenge the alt-right. And I sort of categorize this both online and offline. So in terms of online, I describe in the book how there's both hard and soft approaches to countering the alt-right. So some hard approaches include certain policies that tech companies have already put in place to varying degrees. These include actions like deplatforming or suspension for a smaller period of time. Demonetization efforts, which can be quite important to understanding the fundraising and the financing of these individuals and groups. Content moderation, meaning perhaps not as extreme as deplatforming, but it might be one tweet instead of an account that gets flagged, for example. Other more technical aspects include manipulated search results and shifting algorithm recommendations. So as you sort of brought up earlier, Hannah, in terms of, will some random person just come across this material, this content? Well, probably not. But if someone is already looking into similar YouTube videos, and they can come across this through sort of algorithm recommendations. And then in terms of like the soft approaches in online spaces, I write in the book the importance of looking into counter narratives as well. So, offering positive reinforcement to users that sort of redirects them to different resources that they can seek to disengage with or to exit these movements and groups. And then also something that I don't think is often talked about is the importance of influencer culture as well. And then the role of informal messengers and sort of propping up their credibility and their legitimacy. There's actually a whole group of more left-wing YouTubers called BreadTube, and they sort of make videos to debunk far-right content. And so it'd be very interesting to see their voices be elevated. And then in terms of offline approaches, which is also extremely broad, one important aspect is that governments do need to take into account gender into their counter-extremism programs and understand the motivations that lead men and women into these different movements and groups, which unfortunately is just not often considered when it comes to designing counter-extremism strategies. And then of course, education plays such an important role as well. And this can be gendered too. So in the book, I discuss something called generational amnesia, which is a concept that's applied to climate change, which is a notion that, say for example, fish levels in the lake sort of decrease during one generation. Well, the next generation isn't aware of that change over time. So then what happens over successive generations is that once a species of fish become extinct, it's assumed to be normal. So that's the concept known as generational amnesia. And we can apply that to understanding the role of feminism and women's rights as well, in terms of not taking for granted those progressive social movements which have allowed and it's quite ironic actually, these female alt-right influencers write books, they collect money. These types of actions would not have been possible if it wasn't for women's rights. So it's quite interesting in that way. And then finally, of course, is looking at the importance of social support structures when it comes to offline as well, particularly when these female alt-right influencers describe their personal red pill journeys and losing friends and family members, and how vital that is towards being able to support young people in society.
Thank you very much, Eviane. This was so, it was really, really informative, insightful. And at the last question, you have managed, collect all the different bits needed to form the answer to the question, what do we do with what we have now? You have mentioned briefly the role of the state and the state institutions, and that will be my question for the discussion afterwards. So I look forward to hearing more about that. And now I will give the space and the time to my colleague Maida Champara from the Atlantic Initiative and Greta Jasser.
Okay, good morning everyone, and hello from partly sunny Sarajevo. Today I have a pleasure to have a conversation with Greta Jasser. She is a very successful and highly productive researcher in the field of misogyny and manosphere. Greta and I did have an opportunity to have quite a long preparation, and it was worth it because everything what Greta does, everything what she writes about is very useful, very important, and from my perspective, quite unique. To present Greta, I even had to learn some German, so I will say that Greta is a researcher at University of Hildesheim. And she's a PhD student at Leuphana University in Lindenburg in Germany. And what is also very important that Greta is focused on ALTAC platforms and other openly accessible website forums and communities from the manosphere and the far right. Also, Greta Jasser is a doctoral fellow at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right and a founding member in the Institute for Research on Male Supremacy. Greta, it's a real pleasure to talk to you. And first of all, I will ask you the question, and then we could open a further discussion related to your first question. But you did write a very important publication on male supremacism and the Hanau terrorist attack between online misogyny and far-right violence. And actually, you analyzed quite extensively manifesto written by the shooter. Also, you wrote quite a lot about connection between white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and anti-feminism. And your work really gained very important international attention. So in that regard, related to our first question, you will talk a lot about the incel. You will also talk about further question of the frustration of men related to the woman, and the question that many of men who committed different attacks were not in relationships with women. Taking example of the Hanau attacker who stated in his 24-long page manifesto that he hasn't been in a relationship for the past 18 years. What is also very important is that in your work, you highlighted that misogyny is very much connected to the violence and the terrorist attacks. And we could start maybe with the first question. In your opinion, Greta, what is the relationship between misogyny and far-right views in general?
Thank you, Maida, for the lovely introduction. I'm very flattered, and thank you for having me here today. Maybe one thing for the Hanau article, which you referenced, that was in co-authorship with my lovely co-authors, Ann-Kathrin Rothermehl and Megan Kelly. So I don't want to scoop them under the rug because that was very much a joint effort. And in your introduction and your question, there was a lot to unpack here. And I want to add a little caveat that which applies to my entire talk, and I want to do it here at the beginning, which is that a lot of these questions would warrant a much more nuanced answer than I will be able to give in this half hour that we have today. So I will sometimes speak of the manosphere and the far right, and I'm very well aware that there aren't a monolithic block, and there's a lot more nuance to this. So I will give like a broad brush approach to those emerging threats that this event should focus on today. So let me start with your leading thought on the terrorist attack that we just spoke about in Hanau just over a year ago, when a man targeted shisha bars in a racist act of violence. He murdered 9 people and injured 5 more, then killed his mother and himself. And let me further say that this attack in Hanau was devastating. And I don't want to overemphasize the perpetrator here either, because many people are still very much hurting from the loss of loved ones. What I will say though here in this context, because similar attacks are bound to happen, is that academics and journalists with this particular attack were very quick to describe the attacker as an incel, which is understandable because to some extent there was a lot of interest, the media wanted to know, and there was a lot of pressure to make sense of this very violent and very random seeming at first attack. So let me briefly explain what incels are before returning to your actual questions. Incels, because I don't think everyone is familiar with these online cultures, incels stands for involuntary celibacy. So it's a misogynist online group that centers around now predominantly male, that wasn't the case in the past, but now predominantly men who aren't able to have romantic or sexual relationships, or so they think, and hence they call themselves involuntary celibate. This group received a lot of media coverage over the past couple of years, and they are one of the most emblematic group of the so-called manosphere, which is an online network of misogynist blogs, forums, and websites, etc. And they are the most prominent group, or one of the most prominent group, because of those violent, deathly attacks in the US and Canada mainly, where perpetrators named their lack of romantic and sexual relationships, as well as being connected to incel forums specifically in the motivations for their attacks. So many incels believe that their unluckiness in obtaining a romantic relationship can be attributed to a combination of their looks, which they think is inferior to other men, and feminism. So they blame women for the high standards for a relationship, and society in general for being hostile towards men, what Eviane hinted at, or quite explicitly said in her talk just now. And incels themselves see them as at the bottom of this hierarchy in dating. And it is important that they aren't the only group of the manosphere. I want to point this out once again. And they are in many aspects rather untypical for the manosphere, as they see themselves as quite inferior. But I think it's important still to mention them just because they do receive this broad media coverage. Now back to your introduction with the Hanau terrorist attack, which illustrates how misogynist and racist views can intertwine. As you said, we did analyze the manifesto, and he did mention his lack of success in dating and women, but it was also, and I think that's almost more important, riddled with conspiratorial thinking and misogyny. And he did highlight his frustration with women. And this, of course, does sound a lot of what we can read on incel forums, but it is important to differentiate that not every misogynist who commits an act of domestic terrorism is an incel. And as far as we know, this individual didn't frequent the forums, and misogynist views can grow outside of these particular spaces. So blanket labeling any violent misogynist as an incel doesn't help us when we're trying to understand misogyny and its potentially deadly consequences as well. So male supremacy and sexual entitlement, while they were both present in the incel forums as well as in the manifesto, are much more far-reaching than and are well ingrained in our broader society and in other online cultures. So if we want to avoid trivializing how deeply misogyny, male entitlement, and white supremacy as well are entrenched in our societies, we have to go past this like simplistic slapping on a label, this man's an incel, that's why he killed people, and have to understand a bit better what the motivations are, where they're coming from, etc.
So Greta, I do have an impression that world media are more interested in this question of misogyny, but also the question of incels. Since the attacks in Northern America, which happened in our recent past. So do you really think that this question was that important before we did have attacks in Hanau, but also in Northern America in the last few months?
You say that male supremacist attacks were committed in, I think it got a lot broader media attention through those attacks. And of course, we have the online component. So some of them were live streamed. People could watch live on their computers how people were being murdered. We have the publication of manifestos online, which we didn't see beforehand, or which wasn't possible for, before the internet. And we have this viral distribution via the Chan boards that Eviane mentioned before, that most definitely amplifies the views that the perpetrator wants everyone to know, which is also why the way that the media and us academics is reporting on it is very crucial, especially immediately after the attack. So the attention most definitely has grown over the past, I want to say 5 to 10 years, but there is, of course, and this is a bit outside of my own research, a lot of research on domestic terrorists in the US, that a lot of them had previously engaged in inter-partner violence, but this might lead us a little too far astray from the actual topic.
Thank you very much, Greta, for an extensive answer, but this really leads us to maybe one of our main questions, which is, what is the relationship between misogyny and far-right views? What is the direct relationship between these two subjects?
Absolutely. Allow me to get just a little more technical here. I know my last answer was technical, just let me get just a little more technical yet. Because what I want to say is that both misogyny and far-right worldviews are very much rooted in the belief of supremacy. For the far-right, that's often white supremacy, not exclusively, because there's, as Eviane might know a lot more about, there's not just the Western kind of white supremacy, and I think that's an important topic that I've, for example, worked too little on so far. And for misogynist groups, this supremacy is rooted in sex and gender. So they both presume a sort of natural hierarchy that is meant to order society in a racist and a sexist way. And there's also the belief that this hierarchy is right, that men are entitled to dominate women, that white supremacists, for example, they think that white people are entitled to find themselves at the top of this, quote, natural order. And what we find too is the perception that this natural order has been disturbed. So if this is my starting point, that I think things aren't how they ought to be, that society took a wrong turn, that it's depriving men or white men respectively of what they perceive to be rightfully theirs. There's a sense of aggrieved entitlement. There's something I'm entitled to and I'm not getting it. And this is true for both male and white supremacist movements and groups, for example. So when someone concludes that society isn't how it should be, that it was better in some imagined version of the past, but also, and this is important, that most members of society are blind or unaware of this. This belief that the rest is unaware of how the world really is something that unites both far-right movements and the manosphere. And Eviane mentioned it earlier. This is emblematized by a meme that became known as the red pill. So when someone has taken the red pill, and I would say this is true for both the far right and the manosphere, although it means different things to different groups, it essentially refers to a moment of ideological learning. That is, they accept a new diagnosis of society, what is wrong and what can fix it, that these groups provide and that these online communities can come up with, and that can explain how society as a whole and they as individuals are today. So when people refer to taking the red pill, they mean that from their point of view, they can now see society as it really is and how it's structured. And for the manosphere, that's often the belief that feminism ruins society as it should be. And for the far right, this is often also referred to anti-Semitic conspiracies, not solely, but also to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And those are often interwoven, sometimes interwoven to comprehensive narratives. So we have that they're open to conspiratorial thinking, which is what I just outlined, that they and only they see the reality. And then some go a step further and suspect vast conspiracies of entire societies, of governments, you name it. Both ideologies position men or white people or white men as victims of society, that they're being deprived of something that's perceived to be theirs. And there's a quote from a manosphere blog that I thought I'd bring today, because I think it nicely illustrates that, and also shows some of the tenderness that some users bring to these forums when they start. So it says, traditional marriage was like the gold standard. Even the lowest peasant received his wages in the money of kings. His reward was paid up front. He got a woman in her prime. The entire society was structured so a fool could fall in love. He had a future to aspire to and a woman who was bonded to him and helped him get there. But now the future is cancelled for most men. So what we see here is that there's the sense of the past, that there was some time where things were better, where things were easier, where you got a woman in her prime sort of handed to you if you were a man. And this is also something that both share, which Eviane mentioned in her presentation on the far right as well.
It is not noticeable, Greta, that men, members of different supremacist groups, they do tend to claim to be deprived of something that is rightfully theirs. This is something you just mentioned, and most of the time that's dominance, their dominance within society, but also, more importantly, their dominance over women. Sometimes we do have an impression that they're frustrated with the fact that they have to put more effort to be engaged in a relationship with women. And that really obviously leads to further frustration and maybe introducing some of these men to the far-right movements. This is also something that they have in common with the other groups of the far-right. This is something very much related to different far-right groups. And it is also obvious that almost all of them envision the past that likely has never existed. That's only the romanticized way and the way how they portray this. This is something that probably never existed. Gender roles they would like to have in this society, something that we cannot achieve in this modern society. But this is something that is highly recommended and highly viewed as something that could bring this society to the better place. In that regard, how do male supremacist narrative influence mainstream views and policies?
Thank you. I will try to keep my answer just a little shorter this time. So what I find important here to realize is that these extreme ideologies, as we might perceive them, they don't appear out of thin air. They usually correspond to some currents in society who agree with the basic logic of male supremacist views. Some of them are, in fact, quite common in society and mainstream or pop culture. This means they're common in the way we think and the way we act. So I mentioned male entitlement earlier, and so did you. And that is that men might feel entitled to a woman's body or a woman's attention. And we find this entitlement frequently in our daily lives. I think I look at a very female panel. I think we have all experienced these sort of things. But then there's broader things that are emblematized in pop culture, like being friend zone, which is still a very popular term, as if men and women could not be friends without owing each other a sexual relationship, or if one could not do a nice thing for the other without having some sort of trade in return. Then, of course, there's catcalling, inappropriate comments at the workplace, and outside of it. And all these things are happening in our societies, and quite frequently, as we could have spotted during the Me Too movement. So what I want to say here is that these ideologies in their radical form are rooted in a broader consensus that at least parts of societies hold and that resonate with people, that sort of make sense to people. So these groups themselves might not directly influence policies, although some of them try, especially the more political branches of the manosphere, so the men's rights activist movement, for example. But this is an expression of a broader and often more patriarchal society, or what is still believed in larger strands of society.
So it is obvious more and more, and this is the subject and the issue and the problem we at the Atlantic Initiative talk about a lot, that the rise of far-right and right-wing populist ideologies seems to really go hand in hand with backlash to gender equality and feminist movement. We do see that Istanbul Convention has been revoked, and in many countries that used to be seen as highly democratic countries and highly democratic societies, we've seen that tendency to revoke some of the human rights, but also, of course, gender rights related also to right for abortion, right to protect women against the violence and so on. So your research focuses on online misogyny, but why do we need to worry that much if some men hate women on the internet? On the other hand, people are very aggressive and hate many things on the internet. Why this issue related to the misogyny on the internet and in social networks and media is that important?
Yeah, sure, that is true. People do hate all kinds of things on the internet, and that in and of itself might be an issue that might concern us another time. So now, why should we care about this in particular? I mean, we heard about two very important issues already. We heard about ISIS recruiting online. We heard about female influencers of the far right. And I do think they're equally important. But first of all, what I want to say also, because this is my research area, of course, and this also stands true for most of the other online harms that we talked about. Online misogyny often causes offline violence. I mentioned the Hanau attacks. We already talked about domestic terrorism in North America as well. And it also causes online violence, such as harassment or the doxing of people. That means the publication of their home address, their workplace, their phone number, which of course then has ensuing consequences to their safety. And this is especially true for those who are in the public eye, and as well as others like researchers like us. So when someone receives online abuse, an actual person is at the receiving end of this, and actual people are sending out these messages. And this is more to say, as Charlie said, the online-offline divide is vanishing and it's becoming more problematic. Then some of these communities organize around harassment and are very coordinated when it comes to inflicting online harm. So this is also a point of gathering for them, is particularly to inflict harm. And then these communities might be very attractive to young people, which I find concerning, who struggle to find a partner, who might be in an awkward phase in their lives, who are in a bad place financially and seek help and advice. And I think this is an interesting side note. Self-help for finances, for getting fitter, for eating better is quite common on some of these platforms, and is also linked from and to those platforms. So they might be looking for help and find a community that's both very violent and also demoralizing, while also offering a new perspective on the world. So male supremacist communities, they validate opinions that women are inferior, and that society and feminism are to blame for what they see as wrong in society. And these forums are very easily available on the web, and they nurture a culture of violent talk, of normalizing violence in general and against women in particular. So there might be a breeding ground for extremism. That is not to say that anyone who visits them or engages on the sites will always become a violent extremist, but it's a space that we need to at least be aware of.
Yes, that's for sure. But there is something very interesting, maybe that came up to my mind during the last few sentences you just said. What could be maybe a long-term impact of this online harm inflicted against women?
Yeah, I think online harm against women is something that's, at least here in Germany, has been discussed a lot more over the past couple of months and years, because COVID didn't help with everyone being inside and spending a lot more time in front of our computers. And of course, if once being doxxed, you might need to move house, you might need to change your phone number, you might get in trouble with your employer. So this has real consequences for you, but you also might just retreat from publishing on those issues, especially if you're an academic or a journalist from a minority group, or if you're a woman and you're prone to receive this abuse. You might think twice the next time if you actually want to publish on these things before taking the necessary precautions. I myself have published things anonymously because I didn't want to be subjected to the online harassment that I might receive as a consequence.
Also, Greta, COVID and restrictions is something that we are talking about on everyday basis in every possible subject. But in relation to that, in your opinion, did the misogyny became more publicly accepted after COVID restrictions? Oh,
that's a tricky one. I'm not entirely sure I have a really good answer for you about that. I think what happened during the COVID restrictions, that traditional gender roles became a lot more visible. With people working from home and tending to childcare and doing all the labor that is needed at home. I'm not sure if misogyny got more accepted because or during COVID. I think it's something, or these traditional roles that has always stuck with society, and that might have become highlighted now that there's a light shining on how we organize family life and society life, etc.
Thank you, Greta, to wrap up this amazing presentation of yours, and to thank you very much for answering all the questions, but also to answering some pop-up questions by my side. I would like to conclude this by one constatation, but also a question. Misogyny kind of became more in vogue in the last years, and feminism is obviously pushed back. What could be the mitigation steps? What can we do? What can we recommend? And what we as a scholars and researchers need to do in the future to try to make this society better?
Yeah, I think I want to piggyback a bit on what Eviane said earlier, is that education is for sure key to achieve this, to educate on democratic values, etc., which is why capacitating teachers and training teachers on how to do that, in my view, is particularly important to help young people recognize when they look at extremist content, even though that's quite far from my own research area. And I haven't so far focused on countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism, but I think I can give some answers from my research in general and this online bit in particular. And the first important thing is that we do research these communities, and that the research is funded and can inform policies. Because if we don't know about these communities, we can't, if there's no one keeping track of what's happening, we might be blindsided by the attacks that come from there. And then there's, I think it's important to recognize a few things. And that is that male supremacist ideologies, as I said, are common, even though they might not express themselves in such a drastic way everywhere. Then to recognize that anyone could be susceptible to those ideas, especially those people in crisis, and because these ideologies might explain situations they find themselves in. And then that the views online might be hidden from the immediate surroundings, so you might not know what views your sons or daughters or friends hold, because you can always create an entire new online persona and be someone else on the internet, but only because it's online doesn't mean that those dehumanizing beliefs are less dangerous. And so maybe as a final word for this answer, and I think this is important for mitigating, but also for understanding these groups and movements and ideologies in the first place, it is important that we do take this online logic into account, that things move quickly, that people are mainly anonymous, that we might not always be able to follow what's happening at the moment, but also that the online and the offline sphere are in two distinct worlds from one another, that if someone gets harassed online, they're getting harassed in real life. If someone's being radicalized online, they might inflict physical and psychological harm on people.
Thank you very much, Greta. Thank you very much for mentioning this for the conclusion. Yes, we always have to think about harm, that these kind of behaviors that are really promoting masculinity and misogyny could do to other people. Also, I think that's something that will stay definitely with me, but probably with the rest of our participants and panelists, is you making this introduction in the incel term, but also talking about red pill and taking or not taking the red pill, which is something very much related to the popular culture, but something we really need to think about, and something that is really applicable to any aspect of our life. So thank you very much, Greta, again. It was a pleasure to talk to in this line from Sarajevo to Germany. And now we'll go back to dear Hana Sokolovic for questions and answer session.
Thank you very much, Maida, and thank you, Greta. As you can see, my cat has joined our Zoom meeting as well. They always love to be so present, and obviously this is a topic of high interest for them. I'm going to switch to Bosnian now, so in case you need translation, use the interpretation button at the end of the screen, at the bottom of your screen. Dakle, online ekstremistički i radikalni sadržaj, kao što smo mogli čuti u proteklih sati i 50 minuta, percipiraju se kao stvarna i prisutna opasnost širom svijeta. U Bosni i Hercegovini, kao i u brojnim drugim zemljama, međutim mi ćemo u narednim minutima govoriti o kontekstu naše zemlje, izostaje institucionalno suočavanje i reakcije na ovu opasnost. Mi smo dakle tokom panela razgovarali o vizualnoj propagandi, vrbovanju putem online sadržaja, ženama alternativne desnice i vrbovanju po osnovu rodnih karakteristika, govorili smo o muškoj nadmoći, mizogini na internetu i krajnjoj desnici. Sad, činjenica da internet nudi anonimnost za radikalne i nasilne ideje koje nisu prihvaćene u stvarnom životu, daje mogućnost osobama da ispoljavaju upravo takve radikalne, a ponekad i nasilne stavove, ali sve dok se ti nasilni stavovi, dok ne eskaliraju u otvorene prijetnje, oni vrlo često ostanu neosporavani, i institucionalno, ali i društveno. Posebno kada se radi o takvim stavovima koji su upućeni prema ženama. Mediji se sa druge strane u odnosu na opći prostor interneta oslanjaju uglavnom na samoregulaciju u online prostoru koja često nije efikasna iz nekoliko razloga, brzina komentara koji nastaju u okviru društvenih mreža ili na portalima, nedovoljni kapaciteti u smislu ljudi kako bi se s takvim komentarima izašlo na kraj, ili prosto s druge strane imate medijski senzacionalizam kojim je takav jedan način komentiranja i neophodan da bi radili onako kako rade, neprofesionalno i neetično. To navodim dakle upravo zbog činjenice da smo mi u Bosni i Hercegovini svjedoci brojnih mizoginih online sadržaja i komentara, vezali se oni za konkretne događaje, poput slučajeva prijava silovanja u 2 bosansko-hercegovačka grada u protekla 2 dana ili za opći javni diskurs. Analiza društvenih mreža koje je sprovela Atlantska inicijativa omogućila je uvid u pokazatelje da je antirodna ideologija zajednička desničarskim grupama. I to je ono što smo otprilike čuli u izlaganju naših panelistkinja i paneliste, bilo da su politički ili vjerski ekstremisti i bez obzira na njihova različita ideološka stajališta, ono što ih čini bliskim jedni drugima je upravo ta antirodna ideologija. Analizom online sadržaja krajnje desničarskih influencera, ali i njihovih pratioca, utvrđena je i zapanjujuća univerzalnost u jeziku koji koriste kada pišu o ženama koje, kako oni kažu, nisu po njihovoj mjeri. Takvi pokreti koriste antirodnu ideologiju kao retoričko sredstvo za mobilizaciju mržnje, tako što progresivne ideje o rodnim vrijednostima, ljudskim pravima i jednakosti interpretiraju kao prijetnju onim akterima i institucijama koji smatraju da je njihov položaj koji im je tradicija dala ugrožen feminističkom politikom i konceptom rodne ravnopravnosti. U istraživanjima Atlantske inicijative uočeno je značajno davanje pažnje temama rodne ravnopravnosti među izrazito popularnim selefijskim online influencerima, ali i desničarskim web portalima u sadržajima koje komuniciraju s publikom. Dakle, upravo sva ova istraživanja pokazuju da se rastu nenasilnog ekstremizma u Bosni i Hercegovini mora dati velika i značajna pažnja, čak i kada ekstremistička ideologija ne promovira direktno terorizam i nasilje, može stvoriti opasne podjele u društvu, sistemskim podrivanjem demokratskih vrijednosti i jednakosti. Ova retorika predstavlja posebnu prijetnju da naruši rezultate koji su postignuti u proteklim decenijama u ostvarivanju rodne ravnopravnosti, dakle generalno naročito u Bosni i Hercegovini. To je fenomen o kojem je Eviane upravo govorila u svom izlaganju. To što neka prava u ovom trenutku postoje ne znači da treba zaboraviti borbu koja je prethodila da se ona uspostave. Ova suptilnija vrsta radikalizacije sposobna je da proizvede značajne dugoročne socijalne, političke i društvene izazove. Teme koje su vezane za brak, za odgoj djece, rodne razlike, intimnost, kodeks odijevanja, suzbijanje strasti, vrlo su često identificirane u online prostoru ekstremističkih grupa. Ideje koje se najčešće promoviraju su te da žene moraju biti poslušne, da moraju biti dostupne muškarcima, da muškarci s druge strane onda trebaju osigurati svoju ženu, odnosno suprugu, a djeca moraju biti disciplinovana. Narativ da su žene koje dolaze iz druge etničke ili religijske grupe loše, a da su naše žene u kojoj god grupi mi pripadali dobre, je narativ koji je podsticao masovna silovanja u ratu. Taj ekstremistički online diskurs u Bosni i Hercegovini u nekim slučajevima uključuje i mikropropise za gotovo svaki aspekt života žene. Osim toga, desničarske grupe promovišu mišljenje da su moralni samo žene i muškarci koji su u braku, svi drugi spadaju u kategoriju amoralnih. I na ovaj način brak se promovira kao jedini način osiguravanja dostojanstva žene i garancija da žena ima zaštitnike od onih drugih. Ti drugi su, u ovisnosti od okolnosti, nužno neprijatelji tradicionalnom načinu života i u tom diskursu drugi mogu biti osviještene žene, mogu biti pripadnici LGBTIQ populacije, mogu biti pripadnici drugih etničkih grupa, strane kulture ili u kontekstu posljednjih nekoliko godina migranti, izbjeglice i tražioci azila. Ono što je tim Atlantske inicijative primijetio u nedavnom istraživanju online desničarskih grupa jeste da u regionu, a posebno u Srbiji, Hrvatskoj i Bosni i Hercegovini, postoje hibridne ideološke kombinacije. Recimo, jaki antiglobalistički narativi se kombinuju sa lokalnim političkim temama, regionalnim političkim temama i zajedničkim neprijateljima. Neprijatelji naravno variraju u ovisnosti od političke ili etničke opcije koju određene desničarske grupe favoriziraju, ali jedan element je konstanta u tim desničarskim grupovima. A to su antifeministički stavovi, antirodna ideologija, osviještene žene i LGBTQ populacija kao konstantni neprijatelji. Oni su dakle siguran dio propagandne strategije ljudi koji promoviraju radikalizaciju u regionu. To je zapravo strategija koja je globalno oprobana, o čemu smo čuli upravo u svjedočenjima panelista i koja je očito donijela rezultate. Istraživanja su također pokazala da racionaliziranje nasilja nad ženama na različite načine postoji i mimo implikacija o kojima sam govorila u prethodnim minutama. O tome kako brutalne posljedice, ekstremizam i nacionalizam može imati na živote žena znamo iz ratne historije od 1992. do 1995. Hiljade žena i djevojaka brutalno su i sistemski silovane. Žene u Bosni i Hercegovini su nakon rata u javnosti otvoreno govorile o svojim iskustvima, što je doprinijelo tome da se ujedine u zahtjevima za puna prava i jednakost. I sigurno za nekoliko godina ti zahtjevi i prava koje su tražili nisu nailazili na bilo kakve vrste otpora u nacionalističkim ili konzervativnim vjerskim krugovima u zemlji, ali sada su ti konzervativni vjerski krugovi unutar svih vjerskih grupa u Bosni i Hercegovini mnogo glasniji u izražavanju otpora rodnoj ravnopravnosti, jer su ohrabreni su jačanjem desnice globalno, ali i u regionu i unutar Bosne i Hercegovine. Mi posljednjih godina, naročito i dakle, na prostoru Bosne i Hercegovine, svjedočimo porastu rodno uvjetovanog nasilja. Istraživanja pokazuju da je jedan od važnijih uzroka reakcija na jačanje žena, na jačanje položaja žena nakon rata u svim sferama društvenog, ekonomskog i političkog života. Jake i emancipovane žene su neprijatelji ovakvim grupama. Mnoga istraživanja su pokazala da izlaganje nasilju može imati veliki broj negativnih posljedica na zdravlje i na mentalno blagostanje djece i žena. Djece, dakle, unutar porodica u kojima se nasilje događa. Nasilje u porodici može biti fizičko, psihološko, može biti i seksualno zlostavljanje, a korištenjem prisile i nasilja nasilnik stječe kontrolu nad postupcima, razmišljanjima i osjećajima svoje partnerice. S druge strane, normaliziranje nasilja koje je pogotovo na društvenim mrežama itekako prisutno u Bosni i Hercegovini utječe na promjenu percepcije ne samo kod žena, već i kod onih koji rade u sistemu zaštite. Jako bitno napomenuti da je Atlantska inicijativa u svojim publikacijama nekoliko puta navela da čak i ako muškarci nisu fizički nasilni, desničarska retorika kojom se utvrđuje da muškarci imaju punu kontrolu nad ženama, tako što muškarci kontrolišu ženske financije, kretanje, oblačenje i još mnogo toga, spada u opis takozvanog intimnog terorizma. Prema autoru Johnsonu, intimni terorizam razlikuje se po obrascu ponašanja namijenjenom dominaciji nad partnerom i gotovo uvijek uključuje muškarce koji teroriziraju žene, često kombinujući nasilje s drugim taktikama poput prijetnji i zastrašivanja, ekonomske manipulacije, psihološkog zlostavljanja i izolacije. Sve ovo dovodi do povećanog nasilja nad ženama, gura žene na marginu, pokušavajući im oduzeti glas, njihovo mjesto u društvu, bilo da govorimo o online prostoru ili o političkom prostoru. Zbog toga je dakle izuzetno važno da razgovaramo i da otvoreno skrećemo pažnju, da razumijemo da je problem rodne neravnopravnosti, da je problem ugrožavanja ženskih prava, problem koji stvara posljedice na više slojeva, koji ima svoje kratkoročne, srednjoročne i dugoročne posljedice i moramo u svemu tome da prihvatimo i osvijestimo da je ravnopravnost žena ugrožena jačanjem desničarskih pokreta. Zabrinjava između ostalog da se recimo vođa noćnih vukova Aleksandar Sultanov u određenim vjerskim i političkim krugovima u Bosni i Hercegovini tretira kao prijatelj pravoslavne crkve. Zaldostanov je neko koji je javno izrazio želju da, citiram, vrućim čalikom izgori sav feminizam i homoseksualnost iz, kako je rekao, naše pravoslavne kršćanske zemlje. Zanimljivo je kako ova izjava i njegovi stavovi nisu odjeknuli regionom. Opasni su i otpori Istanbulskoj konvenciji, sve radikalniji govor katoličkih krugova koji se protive rodnoj ravnopravnosti. Postoje ozbiljni razlozi za zabrinutost zbog porasta katoličkog ekstremizma koji je povezan sa hrvatskim etnonacionalizmom. Atlantska inicijativa je uradila značajna istraživanja o podređenom položaju žena u selefijskom diskursu, ali i u drugim konzervativnim islamskim krugovima u Bosni i Hercegovini. Zbog toga se u BiH istraživanja o refleksijama jačanja desnice na prava žena mora shvatiti u kontekstu rizika uzajamne radikalizacije, u kojoj se međusobni oblici ekstremizma jačaju i nadahnjuju. A s obzirom na činjenicu da su vjerski i desničarski ekstremisti usko vezani za podređenost žena, moramo biti budni i pratiti kako se ti radikalni stavovi odražavaju na postepenu redukciju prava žena u Bosni i Hercegovini. Sve ovo, dakle, o čemu smo govorili od početka panela, stavljeno u kontekst Bosne i Hercegovine, nekako i takako otvara pitanje zbog čega ova tema nije dovoljno aktualizirana u javnosti, zbog čega nema pažnju dovoljno ni institucija, ni medija, ni društva i koliko nam je potrebno da najprije osvijestimo tu jednu slojevitost koju izaziva problem ugnjetavanja žena, neravnopravnosti žena. I ja ću zbog toga postaviti našim panelistima možda onim redom najbolje kako smo i govorili tokom panela, najprije za Charlija, koliko je važna uloga institucija, državnih i sigurnosnih, u preveniranju online ekstremističkih sadržaja, vrbovanja i svega onoga o čemu smo govorili u toku panela. I can repeat it in English if the translation is slow.
No, I got the translation through. I mean, maybe you could just repeat it in English so I know.
Yeah, so basically how important is the role of institutions, whether we speak of security or state institutions, in preventing extremism, in preventing basically online extremism and all of the things which come out of it as a problem.
Okay, well, I can confirm that your translators are doing an awesome job because that was exactly the same. So that's a good question. I like to think about counter-violent extremism work through the lens of public health. There's been a few studies that have applied the public health framework of primary, secondary, and tertiary healthcare or public health work to the CVE, combating violent extremism spectrum of activities. So essentially, for each of the different levels, there's a different range of actors and stakeholders and activities that are appropriate. Tertiary CVE is responding to individuals who are already extremists, so essentially de-radicalization efforts and trying to engage in counter-narrative or counter-radicalization measures with a very small, comparatively small population. Secondary CVE is focused on engaging with and developing kind of CVE measures amidst populations that are deemed to be at risk of radicalization, individuals or communities that may be exposed to certain grievances which have been found to accelerate or increase the risk of radicalization among a target audience. And then you have primary CVE, which is essentially everyone else. So in public health, primary public health is geared towards making sure that a disease doesn't take root within a population in the first place. And at the other end, you have tertiary public health, which is trying to cure an individual who already suffers from a disease and making sure they don't relapse. So the reason I like that framework is because there's a wide array of different things at play. And for something like tertiary CVE, of course, that's going to be something that has to be led by law enforcement and security, because it's dealing with people who are already radicalized, already members of these organizations. I mean, at least in the context of violent extremism that relates to terroristic violence. And of course, that's a lot clearer cut in the context of jihadism and Islamism than it is other groups on the far right, for example, which makes it a lot more difficult to conceptualize. But the other end of the spectrum for the primary level CVE, so essentially trying to inoculate a community or population. Of course, governments have a really, really important role to play, but it's a limited role as well, because one of the things of many that really, really matters in developing and deploying effective CVE or counter radicalization measures is credibility and legitimacy and trust. And a lot of the time, governments and government institutions aren't necessarily the best stakeholder to try to engage in activities that rely on there being robust trust and credibility, especially when the audience in question is perhaps not inclined to be totally supportive of the government, if you get what I'm saying. So in that context, community groups, as well as the private sector, are really important. So if we're thinking about online platforms, then the platforms themselves play a role. Of course, there's the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, or no, it is to counter terrorism, GIFCT, which is it's an NGO backed by Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Full disclosure, they fund GNet, the research consortium that we run out of ICSR. But they do a huge amount of work within the tech sector, trying to essentially engage in both primary and secondary CVE. So trying to make social media platforms a better place to be in terms of less extremist content and so on, but also trying to make certain communities on those platforms less exposed to content that may push them in a certain direction. Now, of course, it's a really difficult thing that they're up against. They could be doing more as well, but it's important to keep in mind that we live in a world today where there are just so many different platforms, so many alternatives that are popping up on an almost daily basis. I mean, I focus on jihadi stuff, and jihadis have some kind of technical and technological expertise, but generally speaking, the ability that they have to produce their own platforms while they do exist, their own discussion boards while they do exist, is much less than actors that you have on the far right. And that means that in the wake of interventions by the private sector or kind of public-private collaborative interventions. So, for example, there's a big disruption effort on Telegram against ISIS at the back end of 2019, which was Telegram and Europol teaming up. The migration and the scattering of the jihadi ecosystem was fairly limited to a relatively small handful of platforms. In the wake of the January 6th insurrection, and the removal of a lot of major right-wing players from Twitter and other platforms, there was a much wider scattering of right-wing supporters and right-wing groups that exhibited many of the many similarities with how jihadis have responded to intervention and disruption, but it went further and wider and was more technically sophisticated than we've seen it in the case of ISIS and other jihadi groups. I should say though that I think panelists, my colleagues on the panelists are definitely much better placed than I am to talk about the right-wing side of things, and I would really love to hear from them on that particular aspect if there's time. But also, it's not really my place to be asking questions.
Yeah, but it's a great question, Charlie, and there will be time. Thank you very much for your answer. Eviane, is there something you would add? You did partially through the recommendations and strategies you have basically, let's say, suggested at the end of your panel discussion. You have basically addressed the state institutions partially as well. Is there something you would add in the specific context of what you research to what the state institutions should do?
Yeah, so in respect to state institutions, I had mentioned that government counter-extremism programs should address the gendered ways of recruitment and radicalization in their disengagement and de-radicalization efforts. Certainly, these programs are very good at identifying the role of personal grievances and leading individuals to join such groups or networks. But again, it's not often done so through a gendered lens, and it's not necessarily so my recommendation would be to include the ways that specifically men and women perceive their role within these organizations based upon their perceived gender roles. The reality is that men and women who join these groups and networks do feel empowered and do feel agency, and very often that's not really understood in these gendered ways. And then in terms of actually piggyback, what Charlie just mentioned, in my work, I was also looking into primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of engagement online in terms of de-radicalization efforts. And when it comes to, for example, looking at the role of influencers who debunk far-right narratives, academic research has shown that actually these influencers are most effective at the primary level in terms of trying to reach quite a broad audience. And that's very important. I mean, of course, there have been some problematic interventions in the past when it comes to governments working with influencers. It's important to strike a delicate balance in terms of being able to provide these influencers with institutional support and access to resources, but still providing them autonomy in terms of control over their content and the creativity process within that.
Thank you, Eviane. That was actually really important, the border between where state can help and on the other side when it can start controlling, which should not happen. Greta, is there something you would like to add on this question?
Yeah, just very briefly, because counter to my two colleagues, I'm not an expert on preventing or countering radicalization, but I want to mention, and I think this was clear from most talks, is that the education sector, of course, both for children, but also adult education, can definitely be a tool where the state institutions can make an impact. And the second one is funding civil society organizations, not just those that specify in countering, but also those that provide initiatives for democratic learning, for other activities, etc. This is very much on the primary field, I would say, and this might be very specific from Germany. Not defund them, especially right now, would be a very good first step, but that may be just as my personal opinion rather than as my researcher's opinion.
Great, thank you very much for that opinion, Greta. I will be asking the questions from the Q&A field by our participants. Basically, I will just read them out. The first one is by Emina Kuhinja, a very active young lady from Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina, who I know from different projects of this and similar kinds. Now she has a question for Eviane, and she says, Dr. Leidig mentioned that algorithms work in a way that you get recommended radical content once you have already engaged into a content similar to that one. However, how do we tackle the allegations that Google search engine and social media like Facebook and Twitter push for this content by placing them first in search results, even without one implicitly engaging or wanting to engage with such content? Do social media have the responsibility to self-regulate, Or is this the sphere where also human interaction is necessary to tackle the issue and provide anti-narratives or alternative narratives?
Right, such an important but loaded question. And I would, note the one that is quite controversial as well in terms of the role of social media companies that they play in these processes. First of all, that point about, oh, sorry, I have to go back to the Q&A bar. That point about whether these companies push for that content in the search results. I'm not privy necessarily to their policies on concerning search results and in algorithms and so forth. But what I can say is that very often when we think about the social media companies, we often see them to be quite neutral spaces. The thing is that these are for-profit companies that do offer services to users. And as users, we do sign on to terms and conditions for using their platforms. And this involves the type of content that we post in whether or not that violates hate speech or terrorism policies. I'm sure Charlie can talk a bit about that under his capacity with GNets, which I also am involved with. So it's we have overlapping interest here. And, I think companies have started to recognize the very influential impact that they have in terms of the public space within the last few years. And we see the public being quite cognizant of their role as well. As for example, until 2015, an advertiser could mark white nationalist as a demographic to target in Facebook advertising models. That's no longer the case, which is a good thing, but these companies are sort of in an ad hoc basis trying to rectify and change their user experience on their platforms in order to be more accommodating through initiatives like the Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism, which Charlie mentioned. And in terms of, does social media have the responsibility to self-regulate, or is this the sphere where also human interaction is necessary? Well, certainly it's both of those. As I mentioned, these are still for-profit companies, but they are doing initiatives in order to address issues on their platforms. The thing is, much of the back end in terms of the technical red flagging and takedown, some of that, but a smaller percentage of that is done by machine learning and through artificial intelligence. But most of the content moderation on these platforms are done by human moderators who get content flagged to them. And it's actually quite a traumatizing and stressful experience as a human content moderator to have to sift through sometimes quite brutal and violent content in order to distinguish whether or not it should remain on the platform. So certainly we should be supporting those content moderators. But I will say finally that far-right users are, as I mentioned earlier, are very adept in terms of being able to circumvent regulations on these platforms in terms of using coded language or using dog whistles in order to prevent getting flagged up. So as an example, one of the women I've been doing research on has purposefully sort of misspelled in her Instagram stories things like coronavirus, adding different symbols in there in order so that there's not like an official resource that pops up on the Instagram story that redirects the user to like the World Health Organization website. So it's definitely a whack-a-mole game in terms of responding ad hoc, but certainly it's a combination of tech companies' responsibility, which they have been doing, and also the public on these platforms.
Thank you very much, Eviane. I think that was a very detailed answer to the question. Our next question is for Charlie from Mirza Boljubasic. How did COVID-19 affect on ISIL virtual propaganda, and did fall of caliphate had any effect, and why?
Really interesting questions about how these massive things that are kind of happening in the real world, how they play out and are communicated by the, well, in one instance, ISIS, the organization that was, to all intents and purposes, territorially defeated back in 2019, and COVID as well, which actually I think it's been quite lucky that it's not doing any governance or presiding over any physical caliphate during COVID-19, because that would have made things a lot more difficult for it. It brought up a lot of difficult questions as well regarding vaccine rollout and that kind of thing. But anyway, I digress. In terms of the way that propaganda was used to navigate through the defeat of ISIS in eastern Syria, which came on the back of the defeat of ISIS in Iraq, essentially the ISIS brand had to change tack. So previously the unique selling point had been that it was engaging in statehood, that it had consolidated territories and had a population living under it, if they were living by the rules, purportedly happily. In the wake of its defeat, though, the ISIS brand became more about this cosmic battle between good and evil, between Islam and non-Islam, or the enemies of Islam. It became less about the kind of here and now, less about the material world. So there was a realignment towards this broader journey towards Jannah, towards the afterlife. And a lot of ISIS's communications since then have been geared towards trying to ensure that the organization and the movement remains coherent and has that kind of centrifugal force that holds it together. And I think that's the right use of the word centrifugal. But essentially to have that continuous forward movement and momentum, that wind in its sails. So a lot of its content these days is geared towards demonstrating its military capability, both the kind of spectrum of sophistication, the kind of range of asymmetric to conventional warfare that it's engaging in, but also geographic spectrum as well. So showing that it's as relevant in Syria and Iraq as it is in West Africa and also in Mozambique, the DRC, South Asia, and so on and so forth. It's all about showing that ISIS may not have any territory like it did a few years ago, but it's here to stay, and it's still a movement that's worth being part of. Just quickly to touch on the issue of COVID and how that's been communicated around. Now, it isn't really something that there's been much interest in from ISIS as an organization. Right at the beginning of the pandemic, and for the first 5 months or so, during the first lockdown, the first global set of lockdowns in spring last year, there was a fair bit of emphasis on the toll the pandemic was taking on the enemies of ISIS, a fair bit of communication around what sorts of strategic and short-term opportunities this meant for ISIS as a movement moving forward. So essentially, it was saying that it would be able to take more territory, inflict more pain, carry out more terrorist operations because of the security impacts of law enforcement having to be redirected and so on. But since then, it's kind of dwindled, and there's not much, if anything, that's said by the organization about COVID on a day-to-day basis. Among supporters, there is a bit more communication. There's a bit more relevance for COVID, and also vaccines as well. There's been talk, especially of vaccine development in India and China, and how those have resulted in vaccines that are not permissible for Sunni Muslims to take in India because they were developed, according to this ISIS disinformation, developed using cow urine, I think is the specific allegation. And it'd be interesting to see how these kind of vaccine or anti-vaccine perspectives are reflected or not in the right wing, if either Eviane or Greta has any thoughts on it. The other thing about China, is that ISIS supporters contend that the Chinese vaccine was developed using Uyghur Muslim test subjects. So again, I saw one ISIS supporter referring to taking the, I think it's called Sinovac, the Chinese vaccination, as akin to cannibalization because of how it was developed. So these are things that are relevant and things that are spoken about among ISIS supporters. But in terms of the organization itself, it's kind of steered clear of engaging head on with either issue because it doesn't necessarily make strategic sense for it to do so. If it doesn't respond to how COVID has forced it to change and actually not become more effective, or deal specifically head on with the fact that it doesn't have territory, they kind of give airtime to narratives that it doesn't really want out there. So I think it's sidestepping them so it can carry on with the whole we're still relevant, we're still capable side of things.
Thank you very much, Charlie. I will continue with the second question of our same attendee, Mirza Buljbašić, for Greta. He wrote Q for great, which is also like a really cool way to say her name. He says, when referring to philosophical meanings, in example, right imaginaries of accelerationism behind movies, in examples, taking pills from the Matrix movie, to what extent is such interpretation and discourses, to what extent is such interpretation misunderstood? I'm sorry, he gave two questions, so it got me a bit confused. I should have taken the pill from the Matrix movie. He says, is it possible to counter such interpretation and how?
Yeah, for the case of the Matrix movie, this is most definitely the case that the interpretation is wrong. The producers have come out and said that it was actually about trans rights. And we have a similar case in the Pepper the Frog meme, which is this anthropomorphized cartoon frog, which became emblematic for the alt-right mainly, and whose creator even tried to hold a funeral for the character because he was so unhappy with how the character became a meme and what it meant. Neither of those things helped a lot. So Pepe is still a meme in the far right and beyond by now. And the red pill, blue pill narrative is still very much alive. And I think if we can counter these interpretations, I think the capacity for this is quite limited. For two reasons. The first one is that they do take on their own lives. That's the nature of memes, that they spiral out of what maybe their creator meant for them to be, and that people assign meaning to them, which is a shared meaning as well. And that this meaning is also, or can be, constantly changing. There's a million versions of Pepe that mean different things. And secondly, because no one likes to be told that they got things wrong. If they choose this interpretation of the red pill, and if this became, as Eviane pointed out, an important step in how they got to like becoming a YouTube personality or something like that, this is an act of learning. They might have changed parts of their life. They might have lost contact to loved ones. And I think at this very point, it doesn't matter if someone says, well, but the movie is actually about something else. And you don't want to be called out for being wrong. I could imagine, however, and PVE is known to do that recontextualizing the meme or other memes that are emerging might help. But for these two in particular, I think it's much, much too late.
The damage has been made. The Matrix movie has no longer the identity it had, the core it had. Okay, I'm going to go on with the questions. We have a couple more minutes left for our panel. Ernada Abdibegovic asked, she would like to ask researchers, how did they find women who were open to share open their experience in radical groups? Thank you for your presentations as well. Eviane, could this question be addressed to you?
Yes, of course. And before I do, I just wanted to add a really brief note, because Charlie was discussing the impact of COVID in the vaccination supply. And something that I sort of came across as I was finishing writing up the book was how these women were responding to the rollout of the vaccine. And this is just a great example in terms of like gendered propaganda and recruitment, because that same woman who I had mentioned who deliberately misspelled coronavirus in order to circumvent regulation on her content, she has been very ardently speaking about how the COVID vaccine will supposedly affect women's fertility and their ability to reproduce for the white race, and that this is a coordinated effort by globalists in order to suppress white reproductive rates and so forth. So I think that's just something to add on in terms of how the far right has been responding to coronavirus, and perhaps not such a public way that's known to most people, but still quite important nonetheless. So as far as this question is concerned, I mean, I should note very clearly, I did not contact these women to interview them. All the information that I wrote about, well, first of all, because I was worried about my safety and risk as a researcher, maybe not from these women, but if they doxed me and their followers might want to target and harass me. But secondly is that these women are very open about revealing their personal lives on these social media platforms. And I understand it's part of the narrative and it's part of a performance in order to gain an audience, but that's what I found most interesting, as I wanted to show in the book my experience of what it was like to investigate and really get drawn down into the rabbit hole of following these women in their digital lives. So I apologize if that wasn't clear in the beginning, but all of this information is actually open to anybody who searches for these women. And in terms of just selecting the women, some of them are quite well known in terms of their engagement in the far-right scene. Their appearance at various different types of events and protests. And then from there, I followed these influential figures, and they often appeared on like collaborations or collabs with other YouTubers as well. So that's how I was able to sort of monitor and track these women.
Thank you, Eviane. So basically, it is more accessible than we might think in the first place. You just need to search through your social networks. We have one more question. I'm going to read it out, and then I wish that one of our panelists would answer it. You can like raise your hand or just unmute yourself or something, because I'm not sure who would be the adequate address. So the question is from Laura Porolzhani. Sorry if I ruined your name. I tried. Laura says, when we speak of radicalization and violent extremism in terms of policy, we speak a lot of vulnerable groups. But if we look at the different kinds of radicalization, there seem to be different groups that are susceptible to the message. What does this say about a focus on vulnerable groups? Is that even a useful terminology in designing policies? If yes, what would you pinpoint as a vulnerable group? Inversely, how do you target something that has so many points of entry, or do you believe that there is a common thread, traditionalism, misogyny, that really stick through the different displays of radicalization, and I guess this is violent extremism, VE. Yeah, thank you for the question, Laura. Okay, who's gonna answer? Nino. Greta.
I can maybe give a first go, again with a caveat that I do not work on TV or CV.
Yeah, but you have experience to rely on.
Yeah, so about the vulnerable groups, I think Charlie said it earlier that they perceive radicalization in a public health framework. And we also have within public health, people are also vulnerable to different things depending on their conditions. So I think having a one-fits-all approach for de-radicalizing everyone and everything does not seem convincing to me. And maybe they do have to be fitted at least to the broader ideology and way of thinking and entry points that we see. And I think for myself, and this is very much focused on my research, is that a lot happens online, and maybe that's where you can also find the people depending on like this is the one common thing that what I research, because I research the online, this is where I would go. but this is by no means a one-fits-all answer either. So maybe a very short answer from me for that, and I'm sure maybe one of the other two panelists has something to add to this.
Thank you very much, Greta. It was a useful answer. Charlie, is there something you would like to add? Just keep in mind that we have just a couple more minutes. We actually have no more time, but let's pretend we have a couple more minutes. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I would just echo Greta about the fact that a one-size-fits-all strategy is never going to work, and in fact can be more harmful than it is kind of advantageous to deploy, because it can push people into responding negatively and then hardening in their views, and yeah, that's extremely problematic. So I mean, in any of the CVE work that I kind of am involved in from a practical or advisory capacity, I think it is always just really important to think very carefully about target audience segmentation, and always implementing from the very outset of any sort of programming, whether it's communications based or otherwise, implementing a really robust set of monitoring and evaluation measures, starting off with a target audience analysis that is then repeated 6 months, 12 months, 18 months down the line. So you can get a sense as to whether among this segmented portion of the target audience, whether there has been any positive change, or hopefully not negative, but whether there's been any change in response, direct response to the programming intervention itself. So yeah, I would just agree that it's really important to think through which groups you're trying to target, and try to, as much as is possible, measure the extent to which any sort of CVE programming is actually having meaningful effect, whether that's negative or positive, by having a kind of rolling target audience analysis as a fundamental component of the programming. Thank you very much, Charlie, for the addition to the answer. Eviane, you also have something? Oh, you don't. Okay. Okay, then thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Eviane. Thank you, Greta, Neira, and Maida for being a part of this panel, and a special thanks to all of our attendees. At this point, I'm not sure whether to speak in English or in Bosnian, but we have our valuable translators who translate through the whole panel. I'm sure it was an insightful, informative, and important panel with different topics we have discussed. And I'm sure all of the strategies and all of the actors you have detected to be an important part of the solution and prevention surely do belong on those places. I hope some of them were our attendees in the context of Bosnia and Herzegovina as well. Of course, a big thank you to the Atlantic Initiative for organizing this webinar, and to the Norwegian Embassy in Bosnia and Herzegovina for financially supporting the project which the webinar is a part of. Thank you all for your attention and for your involvement, and have a nice rest of today. Bye.